on the edge of the rainforest in Dominica at the Earthbook Retreat Center. Earthbook TV.
Joining us this evening here on our porch in Dominica are Mark Neil Trahant, Jenni Monet, and Jaynie Parrish. Mark is a professor of journalism at the University of North Dakota. He's a member of Idaho's Shoshone-Bannock tribe and a former president of the Native American Journalists Association. Mark, a co-author of a series on federal Indian policy, was a finalist for the 1989 Pulitzer Prize for National Reporting. Welcome, Mark.
Glad to be here.
Jenni Monet is an award-winning journalist and a tribal citizen of the Pueblo of Laguna, a tribal nation in New Mexico. She writes about Indigenous justice issues around the world. Welcome, Jenni.
Thank you for having me.
Jaynie Parrish is Dene, a tribal citizen of the Navajo Nation from Arizona. She's currently teaching American Indian Studies at the University of North Dakota and is founder of Parrish Digital, a social media management company working with tribes. So, Mark, we're 3 months after Hurricane Maria devastated Dominica. What brings you to Dominica at this time?
Well, a number of things. Right from the first day of the hurricane, on my blog, I started writing about Dominica. So much of the world attention was focused on Puerto Rico and later the United States coast. And immediately I wanted to bring attention to a place I'd been before and a community I knew a little about. And also the idea that many indigenous communities across the Caribbean were being hit by this hurricane and had particular challenges that I wanted to make sure were at least noted. I really am looking at it and at climate change from an indigenous perspective around the world. And I was just in Alaska about a month ago and met with a group of Bering Sea elders. And some of the issues on the Bering Sea are surprisingly almost the same. One person in a village called Nutak told me that they're one storm away from being wiped out. And hurricane force winds are something that Alaska, they don't get the same attention for when they happen, but they definitely happen. And compounding on that, communities whose ability to sustain themselves through hunting and fishing is rapidly disappearing. For example, in Wales, Alaska, the hunt for walrus is a critical part of the food supply. And with climate change, walrus are moving north earlier and they're not on ice, so they're not able to harvest them. And it's completely taken away their food supply, and they're worried that their way of life is quickly disappearing.
You were in the territory yesterday, so in the Kalinago territory in Dominica. It's tiny, I mean, in terms of on a global scale. We've got maybe 2,000-3,000 Kalinago peoples in an island that's maybe 70,000 people in total. So why focus on such a small, tiny population?
Well, the size of the community to me is not particularly important because some of the smallest communities often have some of the most impact. I wanted to focus on it, one, because nobody else is, and two, if we're to understand the changes going on for small communities, they really represent kind of the greater force at work, and in some ways the more dramatic, because you look at just our visit up to the territory, and in the past few years the tribe has been much more successful with coconut production and sales and an economy, and all of that's gone. And so we talked to, just as we were mostly doing just very basic information, but already we've talked to people who were farming coconut who just don't know what they're going to do now. And that is going to be a challenge. I mean, one of the things that really strikes me, and I don't know that it's true here yet, but it's certainly true in the Caribbean, is that more and more communities are going to have to wrestle with the ultimate question of, can you sustain life where you're at? And you're seeing this now. I mean, there's a community in Iran that's had multiple days over 122. And once it starts climbing over 122 Fahrenheit, it becomes really difficult to live outside. More communities are going to face water shortages of proportions that have just, or too much water. I mean, as we saw here on the island. We're up for a challenge that really is something that humanity has not faced before. And how we deal with it, I think, is really going to be critical.
And there's no question that Dominica is on the front lines of climate change. And most Dominicans will agree with that and know that this is part of the new normal, that we are going to be dealing with these effects, these violent weather effects that are going to be completely shifting and changing and challenging us in the way we live. So trying to grapple with that, understand what it means, understand what changes we have to make in our lives, and getting the message out to the wider world about who are on the front lines, because some people aren't feeling it in this way. You know, so they think it's all later down, but it's happening now. So Jenni, you are here on this project as well.
Yes.
Tell us, why did you choose this project to join Mark on it, and what's your role in it?
Mark and I have almost daily conversations about how we're going to fix some of the biggest challenges facing Indigenous peoples. Almost tongue-in-cheek. We think we could take it on ourselves. But I have a lot of respect for Mark's work. And when he told me he was interested in the Kalinago people and their plight in post-Hurricane Maria, I instantly knew the issues at hand, that it was underrepresented, underreported, a people perhaps ignored, but at the same time, a story that's so vibrant and strong and resilient. I mean, the fact that the Kalinago are still here, that is a kind of exasperated phrase that gets repeated throughout the Indigenous world. And it's in that spirit that I think that's what this story is. Yes, on one hand, it is about a post-hurricane kind of sorrow that comes with that, and I feel what you and Tim are going through on your beautiful property here. I can't imagine what it must be like. But on the other hand, it's a spirit of resiliency too, and I think that that's what Indigenous peoples embody so much and represent in the greater worldview. I mean, we're talking about a group of people that should be extinct. There was genocidal paths and systems meant for their extinction. And here we are talking about a people who not only have survived this hurricane, but survived more than 500 years of colonization with the arrival of, or the resistance of Columbus. And it's in that spirit that Mark roped me in, and obviously it took very little convincing for me to be here.
Excellent. And your role specifically?
I'm here as the woman behind the camera. Mark is, as he mentioned, is launching this television show. It's very exciting, and it's, as you know, you're putting on a show right now. It's a lot of work to put together these programs and projects, and I have a background in documentary filmmaking. I'm also a writer, and so I'll be here just trying to dress it up as nicely as possible. We'll get some nice interviews in the next coming days.
Okay. And I want to just turn now to Jaynie. You teach American Indian Studies at the University of North Dakota. And I understand that most of your students are non-native, non-Indigenous.
That's correct.
And so what is that like? I'm just, because you're also an activist and you're a tribal elder. So what does that mean for you to have a room full of non-Indigenous students?
Well, I'll give you a hardcore example. I had a student in my class, and, Standing Rock was happening the first semester I was teaching. And it was tense, but they didn't understand the realm of what this meant in their state 5 hours away. And the image that they were getting, the ideas they were getting from the local media was it's not helpful, very negative. It's continuing in the old rhetoric. And the simple phrase of, why can't the Indians just be grateful for what they have, comes out in conversations. Or why do we have to pay attention to these Indians? Or don't the Indians just get the government checks? I mean, these are really rampant, deep-seated beliefs of Native people. And so I have to listen, but I also have to figure out an argument or a framework that can curtail that. And it comes back most of the time to basic human experiences. And what I start out with, even before getting to that, for example, is I have them explore, what is your creation story? Where does the world begin for you? How do you understand that? To try to even get them in a small framework to think how other people think. It's not Christian worldview. It's completely different than that. Mm-hmm. And so I have them do a lot of self-exploring, but then also try to reframe in the language that they understand. Because even using words like Indigenous, colonization, sovereignty, the impacts of A, B, and C, it's very, very elementary. And these are college students that have never had any exposure to very much.
And just understanding inequality.
Understanding inequality,
what exactly
privilege, diversity, inclusion. Yes, very basics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
All the words that just got banned.
Exactly.
By our president
It's
and our administration.
a few steps forward, 500 years backwards. So let's look at Standing Rock and your role there, Jenni, and how was it for you to cover the struggle? And did you choose an angle when you talk about reporting from the front line? Did you feel it as an emotional response that you had to tell a story, but from what angle did you tell it? As an Indigenous person, as a feminist, as an environmental activist, as a journalist? How did you decide how much distance you wanted to be from that story, and how much emotion or passion or activism did you want to put into it?
There's no question that I was there first and foremost as a journalist. I don't really see myself as an activist at all. Perhaps maybe only in the aftermath of my arrest at Standing Rock do I see myself as an advocate for press freedom, I think. But I don't think there's ever a way that an Indigenous person can separate their indigeneity for being on the ground and reporting in a circumstance like Standing Rock. But for me, why journalism is so important to uphold as an Indigenous writer is because I think it is so easy for outsiders to just stereotypically look at somebody and say, obviously this is an activist writing advocacy narrative, and it undermines it. It doesn't elevate the conversation in a way where we are inherent of these communities. We understand them perhaps better than anybody else, and particularly when we are formally trained to write and to educate and to analyze the situation, that credibility matters more than anything. And for me, I upheld that in the 6 consecutive months that I reported from the reservation. I think I was very deliberate in the narratives that I chose to write about. If you look at my bylines over the course of the movement, certain events would happen and I may not have a piece out about it for another 72 hours, if not a couple of days longer. And that was really to stew, to understand the situations on the ground, and to reach for an angle that I knew wasn't going to be covered by an outside press, even if there was very few outside press joining us, because, let's face it, the media, the established legacy media, was very slow and unsteady to respond to the movement at Standing Rock. And that is for another reason why I upheld my journalistic integrity more than anything, because there were so few journalists on the ground, and there were certainly no shortage of water protectors. I don't know if that answered your question.
So it's important for you not to come at it as an activist. You're saying when it's this type of issue, to do the look at it as a journalist, and to keep a professional distance.
Well, there are so few journalists like Mark and I in this industry today, and not only just who understand the issues from just Indigenous perspectives, but also understand that narrative that I feel like we've inherited from an entire generation ahead of us, who has unpacked some of and I think this word gets used a lot, but it has decolonized a lot of the understanding for people on what Native American identity and society represents. Some of the things that Jaynie's talking about, right? These kind of stereotypical views that we don't pay taxes in the United States, that we get free college educations, that that we. What's another one?
There's so many. Yeah, you can get into the social realms of just poverty, underlying poverty, and just a lot of really negative aspects of.
And so we're constantly having to overwrite that, and we have an entire generation ahead of us who's done a really wonderful job at doing that. And I feel like part of my job is to uphold the integrity of that narrative that I've inherited, but also, if I'm fortunate throughout my career, it will be to advance it a little bit as well.
Now, you said when you got arrested, that might have been a tipping point in terms of being an activist, and now you need to defend yourself. And now there's a whole nother chapter coming out for you. So where do you see that going, or taking you to another?
Yeah, well, I'm not happy about it. It's definitely complicated matters. I would just prefer to just write and move on to the next thing. My trial date is scheduled for June 1st, 2018. And interestingly enough, I just heard from one of my attorneys today who offered me another plea bargain to just bargain away the charges. And they're unfair plea bargains in my view. And there's just there's a lot of the word I'm searching for. There's a lot of amateur litigation happening in North Dakota right now. They made over 800 arrests, and this small county in North Dakota has very little experience in managing a quarter of those arrests, and yet now they're faced with a caseload that they, I think, are overburdened with. And certainly when they start challenging free press in America at a time where we have a president of the United States who's undermining press freedom every day, that doesn't help their case either. And so my arrest has become more than just me getting arrested on February 1st for what I feel I was doing my job. There's been a lot of actual press freedom coalitions that have turned their view on my case as an example to see what will happen. And for that reason, too, I feel like it's worthy to just to pursue the course and go through the courts.
There's a lot of deep-seated racism and discrimination in history in North Dakota with tribes that Standing Rock and what many of these arrests also represent is just the backlash of the punishment of what you do when you stand up, speak up, protest, or try to, prevent a pipeline from coming through your home.
And tell the story.
Yeah. So I think the whole legal aspect is very also what the backlash is. And that's not new to Indian country, unfortunately. But Mark has some good stories about the fishing wars in the Northwest that kind of represent some of the similar issues of what was happening in the United States.
The thing about Standing Rock that I think somehow is missed in this narrative is that it was this moment that brought together a clarity of voice saying, this is the moment when the world has to stop the craziness around us. And we know our future is not fossil fuels. The pipeline was representative of it. It wasn't the pipeline itself. It was the larger issue of this is not going to work anymore. When you talk to young people and they see this, it's interesting. There are two things out of that part of the world that I think is fascinating. One is just a couple of miles from Cannonball, where that occurs, is the 100th meridian. And the 100th meridian is a line on the map that runs, that divides the United States. But when you drive across North Dakota and you cross the 100th meridian, suddenly you hit the part of the country that has no water. And that's been true since the 1800s. Well, it's been true for at least since the 1600s. And that leads to another story. And the story before that is at one time, a village just north of Cannonball was one of the largest cities in North America. Mm-hmm. And that city, folks decided they had to move. And they picked up and moved. And it was that era's climate change on a regional scale, nothing like what we're facing today. But the people knew they had to move into a different type of lifestyle, went from giant storage facilities where there was an urban environment to much smaller villages, but it happened right there. And I think that's really extraordinary that this one juncture in the world is where these stories are surfacing.
So what is the feeling for you, Mark, when you are in the Kalinago territory? Do you have a, what's your emotional response, maybe?
Well, what I particularly love about the Kalinago story is they were the very first tribe that led a resistance against Columbus. And it was a serious resistance. And if you read the journals in October 1493, Columbus couldn't land on Dominica and finally gave up. Didn't come back for a while. And if you look at all of the islands, this is where the most resistance was from the Spanish invasion, and folks wanted to preserve a way of life. And over time, that's manifested in different ways. I mean, one time the Kalinago people were on this side of the island, then they pushed to the east side to get away from everything. And then when the British plantations came, they moved north. They figured out a way and a strategy to survive and resist. And I think both survival and resistance are key ideas going forward. And I just want to say something about journalism context, because I think one of the reasons why Jenni and I work so well together is I don't do straight journalism. I'm not an activist, and I stay away from being an activist, but I'm very much a former editorial page editor, and I definitely write opinion. And I have a point of view on almost everything I write, and I don't think I'm trying to convince people, and that's part of the type of journalism that I do.
Can I ask something on that? I mean, the beauty of Standing Rock was the beautiful tactics that were used. I mean, the people were incredibly disciplined, organized, non-violent. I mean, it held together for a long time. It was an incredible message to the world. It also, I think, at the time, relied upon the other side listening. Today, in this new climate, are those same tactics viable? Is a journalist approach viable if nobody's listening?
I'm not sure people were listening in North Dakota at the time.
It'll take a while for it to sink in.
I view as this is a long story, and this is a layer on layer on layer of story. Just before Standing Rock, the most successful social movement, certainly in Aboriginal Canada, was Idle No More. And all of the lessons of Idle No More were applied at Standing Rock, plus new ones. And I think that's when it's interesting how I've always been interested how technology changes story. And Standing Rock was an example of that. If you look at exactly what was said at Idle No More and how people communicated the issues with Idle No More, they used every social media tool they could, but there was one missing that they had at Standing Rock that they didn't have at Idle No More, and that was Facebook Live. When Facebook Live came on the scene, it amplified the message in new ways, and folks immediately took to it. I actually think the importance of this moment is that social media is actually an older form of storytelling, and that this hierarchy of storytelling that newspapers relied on, and TV stations and cable, is a very new technology that's going away in this larger form of how people tell stories.
And it's access too. It's giving access. So many more people access to storytelling and to being able to respond immediately.
And to share. I mean, the danger is when it's algorithm based is that you cut your people out that you're not going to convince. But I'm not sure that's always been the case. The United States is a little different history because we've tried to have this idea of an objective press. But if you go through Latin America, every major city has a right-wing newspaper, a left-wing newspaper, a center-wing newspaper, and you get your news by kind of piecing together those different points of view. And social media does that too. And so I think really the challenge for that in stories like Standing Rock is for people who are not interested to get onto the feed and to make sure the algorithms allow them to learn that story as it unfolds.
So when we talk about point of view and storytelling, and who are your main subjects in your story here on the Kalinago? Who are you focusing on? The chief, the village council, the tribal council? Are you trying to cut across the society with...
We'll know more tomorrow, and we actually had this conversation. I probably give a little more weight to tribal governments, and I want to make sure that is represented. But at the same time, we need to tell the story through people, because it's people who are going to be impacted by whatever happens. I mean, tribal governments are not unique in the sense that it still comes down to, what are you going to do for the farmer who lost the coconut and is now... I mean, one of the guys we talked to on our first visit has 11 children. That's a huge obligation. And the idea is his oldest daughter was commuting to the capital for nursing school. He can no longer afford that. He's not sure what to do. She doesn't know what she's going to do. And it becomes a cycle of despair. And I think that's something that gets beyond any government. It requires kind of that human connection.
Yeah, that's a question not just in the territory, but in all of Dominica. There's so many job losses. There are so many dreams that have to be deferred. There's a lot of huge challenges where people can't yet see the light, at the end of the tunnel.
Well, I think that's one real failure of journalism, is we're already seeing the numbers of migrants moving, not just from Dominica, but from Puerto Rico, from other places. And Puerto Rico, it's under the radar because they're U.S. citizens. And so they move to New York and no one counts them. But the one-way tickets are already a data piece that's extraordinary, 30-40% increase. And if you look at the whole globe and the prospects for a changing climate, migration is going to be a key issue. Again, because there are places that people can't occupy, either because of the climate being so challenging or because they've lost their livelihoods.
Maintain your positivity and your vision in the light of all of those conflicting interests and all those conflicting groups. How do you find a path through that as a human being?
I just think it's in the spirit of resiliency. I have a podcast. It's called Still Here, Modern Stories of Resilience Indigenously Told. And it really is in this spirit of beating the odds over and over again. And what does that look like in the 21st century? And it looks like Kalinago. It looks like Standing Rock. It looks... we'll see what Bears Ears has to say, but it looks right now like Bears Ears, with all of those tribal nations filing a big fat lawsuit against Donald Trump. And it's this it's just this true grit, as my friend Sarah Sunshine Manning says, that Native people have, mostly Native women. We survive off of this grit, and I think the only thing that really brings me down is what... do you need me to wait?
The Rainforest Studio.
It's kind of nice. Yeah. You tell me when to go.
I think that mic's close enough.
Okay. I think what is most discouraging for me, more than anything, is this consistent and perpetual education that I feel like needs to be performed over and over again to outsiders who aren't paying attention, who aren't listening, who aren't reading in, and may have been affected by something like Standing Rock, but the staying power just isn't really there. And so now it's the heavy lift all over again. And where's that stamina going to come from over and over again? And I've spent this past year really just processing that in many ways. And I think that's really what is most discouraging for me. But the rest of the narrative I find quite uplifting. But I'm an optimist.
Yeah, you have to be an optimist too when you live in a hurricane zone.
Exactly.
And, and deciding to stay after something like Maria hits.
That's right.
You have to have some sort of optimism.
There was this woman, Miranda Langlois. She's Kalinago, and from what I've gathered just from the introductions is that she's quite a leader in the community. And when we were introduced to each other, Standing Rock became central to our conversation. And she had mentioned that she was a part of a effort from Kalinago to not only write a resolution that got sent to the Standing Rock Sioux tribe in solidarity with their stand for clean water against the Dakota Access Pipeline, but that she had actually gathered people together for a prayer ceremony in the community that, one, didn't surprise me, but two, really I found quite touching, because I've been in Indigenous communities around the world since Standing Rock, and that has been something so central to the Indigenous narrative in Nepal, in Bangladesh, certainly across Indian country in the United States. And if you talk to water protectors who are still healing and trying to make sense, there's a real true fatigue, I feel like, from Standing Rock still, people still processing that moment and what it meant to them. There's very little doubt that those prayers, not only that were kind of planted on the borderlands of the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation in those months of the movement, but they were also fostered from around the world. And there's a deep understanding about that.
I was going to say, with Miranda, there was a beautiful thing in connection to that with resiliency, and we had a small chat, and we were laughing about the circumstances, bringing humor. I think that was also a great part, as they get to still have their sense of humor out of all of the chaos. And that's Indian country in the United States. That's Indigenous people, I'm sure, all over the world. Is no matter how many times you go against the odds, you have prayer and you have humor. And that's what she was saying to me yesterday. I said, what do we do? What kind of message do I tell my students? And she's prayers. Prayers is all we need. And we've been here a long time, and we're always going to be here. So that was powerful.
Wow. And she was 14 years old when she went through her first hurricane. And she said, never again I'm going to do that. And she laughed and said, and now I'm just rebuilding.
Yeah. I get a lot of strength from the elders who've gone through these, and they're still here, and they just pick up and they just keep going. And there's always humor, there's always jokes, there's smiles, and it's I get a lot of strength from that, because we're learning. We're learning, and these are our amazing role models. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I first came here in around 1985 or 6, and immediately thought the world needs Dominica. It's just that important a place. When so much of the world is, and it's true when you get out of town, but there's just so few places left in the world that you have the sense of calm and really inspiring beauty. I mean, I think of a handful of places where that impacts. When you see it immediately, you get connected to it. And I knew from the first time I was here I was going to come back. I just didn't know when, because it moved me so much. Mm-hmm.
Just being one out here with nature is automatically, how can you ignore the peace that exists around here? But I also just find it absolutely appropriate that we're here on this beautiful property that is living this, as you said, this bottom-up, just transitional way of living, the kind of message that I think Mark is promoting and the story that he's aiming to tell, and that we're in this environment of that. It feels very natural. It also feels very holistic, just in the work that we're here and meant to do. And so I just am really grateful for what you do, Jessica and Tim, and your vision and your patience that you have out here to create this beautiful space. And it's really, I'll be back. I don't know when, like Mark. I'll come back, and I'll come back here and hang out with you guys.
All right.
Thank you.
And we'll take you to some really cool places that, we'll hopefully have regenerated by then.
Well, and
there's a lot.
In the spirit of resilience, I'll be thinking of you as I think of all of these things, because I understand that there was this nice peak happening here at Dominica before Maria, and so my heart's heavy for you guys as well.
applying it. you
That's
know.
true.
And you know, this is all powered by a waterfall. So it's
amazing.
clean energy, it's renewable, and it's bountiful on this island and in many places.
Well, thank you for paving that way here. It's nice.
And just before I wrap, can you give me like the name of the show or anything on a possible launch?
Give your
What
tagline.
to look out
Yeah.
for?
On your tagline, Mark.
Yes.
And where will be aired?
Yeah, that's right. We don't have those
Or
details.
your next
yet.
book or something like that?
Oh, my next book's on disruption, but the name of the show is Wasaha, broadcast on a new network called FNX, so it's not too new now, First Nations Experience. It's an hour-long show, and it will debut sometime in the spring of 2018.
Well, thank you all. I mean, what a stellar panel.
And how lucky we were to
I
find
know, right?
That's right.
To meet you too. It's been a blessing.
Okay,
Thank you,
all.
guys.
Thank you.
All right, we're off.
All right. Well, thank you for your patience too.
you. You're patient. We're sorry we're so late.
It worked.
Thank you. Oh.